Every occupation needs a face. Every regime needs enforcers. And for the Dominion, that face wasn't just a cot. It was Damar. Before he was a freedom fighter, before his name was etched into Cardassian history as a martyr for rebellion, Damar was someone else. A loyal, willing collaborator. Not a bystander, not a tragic cog in a machine he didn't understand. He was part of the machine. When the Dominion annexed Cardassia, it wasn't a quiet shift in power. It was an imperial pivot, wrapped in promises of restoration and strength, but fueled by ruthless subjugation. Damar didn't just welcome it, he helped make it possible. He stood by as the Dominion reoccupied Deep Space Nine, watched as they brought tyranny back to Bajor's doorstep, and enforced their rule with violence. And yet Star Trek, in the end, wants us to see him as a hero. That's not an accident, it's deliberate. It's a part of a broader pattern in fiction, especially in war narratives. The redeemed collaborator. The idea that someone who once upheld a brutal regime can switch sides and through bloodshed and sacrifice become one of the good guys. But to ask whether Damar was a good man is the wrong question. The better one, the harder one, is this. Was he ever held accountable? Not just by the characters around him, but by the narrative itself. We met Damar early on as little more than Ducat's shadow, a background officer who laughs at cruelty and drinks to cope. He's not complex, not nuanced, not yet. He's the kind of man who kills Ziyal, not for strategy, not for survival, but out of blind loyalty to power. He is, in many ways, the perfect collaborator. Obedient, violent, tragically proud. And that's the foundation his entire redemption arc is built on. So before we can examine the man who died for Cardassian's freedom, we need to confront the man who lived for its subjugation. A man doesn't kill for a cause unless he believes in it. And Damar believed. For most of his time under Dominion rule, Damar wasn't resisting. He was adapting. He was surviving. And maybe, deep down, he hated them. He hated Weyoun, hated the Jem'Hadar, hated being told what to do. But he still did it. He enforced their will. He took their orders. And he looked the other way as war crimes were being committed in Cardassia's name. Because at first, it worked for him. Cardassia was strong again. After the humiliation of the Klingon invasion and the political chaos that followed, the Dominion offered a lifeline. Stability, power, revenge. Damar saw his people back on top. The military reinstated, their enemies crushed. As long as Cardassia benefited, he was willing to stomach the cost. The suffering of others, Bajorans, Federation officers, even civilians, was irrelevant. What mattered was that his world was back in control. And so, for a long time, Damar wasn't torn. He was comfortable. One of the clearest reflections of who Damar truly was during this era is how he treated Kira Nerys. While the Dominion occupied Deep Space Nine, he didn't just dislike her, he despised her. As a Bajoran, as a former terrorist, as a woman daring to speak as an equal. His contempt was palpable. He mocked her, dismissed her. He saw her presence as an insult to everything Cardassia had once stood for. Not because of anything she did, but because of who she was. She represented everything Damar had once helped to oppress. But perhaps the most chilling moment in Damar's arc, and the clearest proof that he wasn't some morally conflicted cog in the machine, was the execution of Tora Ziyal. Ziyal wasn't a threat. She wasn't armed. She was just a young woman who made a choice. To stand by Garrick. To stand by the Federation. To stand against tyranny. Damar didn't kill her in anger. He didn't lash out. He killed her calmly. Methodically. Because she betrayed Cardassia. Because she betrayed Ducat. And that's the heart of it. Damar's loyalty wasn't just to his planet. It was to Ducat. He idolized him. Hero worship. Plain and simple. In Ducat, Damar saw the embodiment of everything he believed Cardassia should be. Strong, cunning, unyielding. Even as Dukat descended into madness and moral rot, Damar still clung to the image of the man he had followed for years. A father figure, a war hero, a symbol of pride in a galaxy that had humbled their people. But Dukat was never a hero. He was a tyrant, a narcissist, a monster who justified genocide and called it order. And Damar, he didn't just serve that monster, he admired him, he emulated him. That's why he pulled the trigger on Zial, not just to protect Dukat, but because he believed her betrayal deserved it. In that moment, there was no conflict in him, no hesitation, just purpose. There wasn't the act of a broken man. It was the act of a true believer. And that's the Damar we have to reckon with. Before the rebellion, before the speeches, before the redemption. A man who upheld a brutal occupation, who silenced dissent, who killed without question. Because in his mind, he was right. So before we can admire the man who fought to free Cardassia, we have to face the one who helped enslave it. There's a moment, just a flicker, where Damar begins to see it. Not the full truth, not yet, but something. A hesitation, a weight, a slow grinding in the back of his mind that no longer feels like pride, but pressure. And that's where the doubt begins. He starts drinking more, louder, less composed. A man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Dukat, who executed traitors without blinking, is now slumped behind a desk, swearing under his breath, pouring another glass. He's still loyal, still operational, still issuing orders, even as he drinks, even as he complains. He signs the authorizations. He oversees the raids. He watches Cardassians disappear, and he doesn't stop it. He questions the Breen Alliance, and Weyoun ignores him. He objects to Cardassian citizens being sacrificed in Dominion offensives, and is reminded he doesn't give the orders. Then comes Septimus III, 500,000 Cardassian soldiers, the 11th Order, slaughtered by Klingons. Not in some glorious last stand, not holding a vital stronghold, but abandoned on a strategically worthless world. And the Dominion doesn't mourn. Weyoun smiles, says it forced the Klingons to waste resources, calls it a strategic victory. And Damar sees it, the truth he's been avoiding. They don't see Cardassians as allies, they see them as tools. And tools don't get eulogies. He resents Weyoun. He hates being talked down to. He hates the Dominion's presence in Cardassian space. But not because of what they're doing to others, but because of what they're doing to him. His ego, his pride, his image of Cardassia. That's what's wounded, not his conscience. Because the truth is, he never mourned Zial, never apologized to Kira, at least not yet, never condemned what was done to Bajor. He just didn't like being on the receiving end. And that's the root of it. This isn't a man struggling with morality. It's a man struggling with humiliation. His loyalty hasn't cracked, not yet, but the blade is dull. And something inside him knows, if it breaks ugly. He hadn't switched sides, but the silence was starting to feel like surrender. Even before the war was over, before Cardassia fell, before the resistance succeeded, before Damar's body hit the ground, the narrative had already begun to change. He was no longer the enforcer, no longer the executioner, no longer the man who served Dukat, who silenced dissent, who pulled the trigger on Tora Zial. Now he was a patriot, a freedom fighter, the face of Cardassia's resistance. And the Federation needed him to be that, because the enemy of your enemy is much easier to explain if he dies a hero. Statues were already being imagined, records rewritten, footage recut. Kira would call him brave in public. Starfleet officers offered respect. The Bajoran government would send condolences. And why not? He had turned, he had fought back, he had died trying to reclaim his world from tyranny. But here's the problem. What if dying for a cause isn't the same as being redeemed by it? What if a man can oppose tyranny today because it betrayed him, not because he believes in freedom? What if a collaborator can become a symbol of resistance without ever being held accountable for what he helped build? This is the danger of wartime narrative. Damar was valuable, useful, and then martyrdom sealed the story. Dead men don't get cross-examined, they get honored. And so the myth calcified. Damar, the fallen general. Damar, the voice of Cardassian defiance. Damar, the one who stood up to the Dominion. Not Damar the enforcer, not Damar the killer, not Damar the man who only turned when the machine he served stopped serving him. He didn't need a trial, didn't need to apologize, didn't need to explain. He just needed to die, at the right moment, with the right cause, in the right uniform. And the legacy would rewrite itself. There are two moments, two flickers of something real, when Damar feels human. Not tactical, not strategic, not useful. Just human. The first is when he kills Rusat, his fellow officer, his friend, to protect Kira. Rusat wanted to continue the old Cardassia, wanted to rebuild it, on pride, blood, and betrayal. And Damar finally says no. He says something along the lines of, his friend's Cardassia is gone. It's the first time we see him reject the past. Not because it failed, but because it was wrong. Then later, after the rebellion has cost him everything, he clutches a datapad in silence. His wife, his children, his family, gone. A targeted strike. No warning, no survivors. Who would do this? He asks it like a man broken open. And Kira answers him, with bitterness sharpened into sarcasm, "Yeah, Damar, what kind of people would do that?" And she's right. And for once, he doesn't argue. He doesn't excuse it. Doesn't redirect the blame. He just breaks. In those moments, something inside him shifts. But here's the question. Is that enough? Is a flicker of regret enough to balance years of collaboration? Is one act of sacrifice enough to erase the orders he gave? Is dying with a different uniform on the same as redemption? Because Damar never stands trial, never confesses, never looks the past in the face and says, "I was wrong." He dies before he ever has to. And maybe that's the point. Maybe his arc ends, not because it's complete, but because it's convenient. Because Star Trek needed a martyr. Because the audience needed closure. Because letting him live would mean letting him speak. And what would he say? Would he admit what he did to Bajor? Would he ask forgiveness from Kira? Would he spend the rest of his life rebuilding what he helped destroy? Or would he revert? Would he become a new version of the same old thing? A patriot in peacetime, ready to defend a better Cardassia, but never really reckon with the one he helped ruin? We don't know, because the writers didn't let us find out. And maybe that's where the real revisionism begins. Not with what Damar did, but with what we let him become. By the time the war ends, Damar is no longer a collaborator. He's a symbol of resistance, of redemption, of sacrifice. A man who turned against the Dominion, stood alongside the Federation, and died for a liberated Cardassia. And in many ways, that story works. It's clean, it's dramatic, it's hopeful, but is it honest? Because Star Trek has always been about ideals, about better futures, about who we choose to be. And Damar's arc raises a difficult question. Can a story about hope also be a story about accountability? Because if we're being honest, Star Trek Deep Space Nine didn't fully answer that. It gave us the redemption arc, the sacrifice, the closing beat, but it skipped the reckoning. There was no tribunal, no confession, no acknowledgement of the past beyond a few lines of dialogue and a single moment of silence. Damar becomes the face of the resistance, not because he earned forgiveness, but because the war needed a hero. And maybe that's the point. Because DS9 was never just about morality. It was about power, and trauma, and survival. It showed us collaborators, tyrants, broken governments, and broken people doing what they could to live through impossible times. But in the end, even it couldn't resist the myth. The idea that anyone, no matter what their crimes, can be redeemed, if they die at the right time, in the right place, for the right cause. And maybe that's comforting, but it's not justice. It is what people needed, because in the ashes of war, you don't always get the truth. You get narratives that help the living keep going. Cardassia had to be welcomed back into the Alpha Quadrant. The Federation had to believe in reconciliation. The galaxy had to see a face they could forgive. So they gave it one. They gave it Damar. And maybe the lie helped. Maybe that's how healing starts. But even so, we can't forget what it cost. A reminder that fascism doesn't always wear a villain's face. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it gives speeches. Sometimes it regrets its choices, only when the consequences finally arrive at its own doorstep. And if we forget that, if we let the legacy of men like Damar be rewritten before the end, we risk making the same mistake. Not just in fiction, but in history. Because stories shape memory, and memory shapes power. And in the end, Star Trek may have told a great story, but it might have missed the most important one.